Hi all, hope you're staying safe and well. Today's video we're going to be looking at one of the most important scenes in Romeo and Juliet, which is Act 2, Scene 2. Now, this is commonly referred to as the balcony scene, and it's one of the ones that if you are to mention Romeo and Juliet to somebody who's not really studied or understood the play, this is the scene that people normally think about, with Romeo stood on the ground and Juliet up on a balcony. So commonly known as the balcony scene. This is where we have to suspend our disbelief a little bit in the way that the drama is going to unfold. So we had all the tension and drama of Act 1 accumulating in the meeting of Romeo and Juliet at the end of that act. What we have now is Romeo sneaking back into the party to pledge his love for Juliet, and he does so in a very romantic and a very flamboyant and a very risky sort of way. Okay, so as I mentioned in that first part of the video, we do have to suspend our disbelief a little bit at this point about how fast things move and how quickly things start to take place. So we've got to bear in mind that in the setting of the play, Romeo is meant to be 16 and Juliet's slightly younger at 14. And this is meant to be their first experience of true love. This is their first experience of someone who they feel destined to be with, someone who they feel so infatuated with and so obsessed with after the first meeting. Now, this is the part we have to suspend our disbelief about how quickly they fell in love with that first glimpse and the first conversation that they had. Obviously, the staging of the play has to fit in with this, so we have to think about how fast things are moving, and we have to suspend our disbelief about how quickly you could fall in love with someone, but believing in this idea of love at first sight. So Act 2, Scene 2 is really significant. What we have is Romeo starting to take a risk. He has decided that he cannot be without Juliet. He needs to see her again, no matter what the risk, no matter the fact that she's a Capulet, and he decides to break back into the Capulet party, which we saw in Act 2, Scene 1, leaving his friends behind and breaking back into Capulet's mansion. Okay, so at the start of Act 2, Scene 2, we have Romeo breaking back into Capulet's mansion, and he says to himself, he jests at scars that have never felt a wound. Essentially, it's okay for Mercutio and Benvolio to talk about madness and love when they haven't felt anything like I have done. So Romeo sees himself as separate and different. That's another example of him isolating himself from his friends. And then what we have is Juliet appearing in the window above as Romeo breaks into the courtyard, and you can see Juliet, and he goes on a long soliloquy. So this is a special dramatic device where a character is speaking their thoughts and they're speaking to themselves. So he's not speaking to Juliet at this point, he's speaking to himself about Juliet. Now what we see in this long speech is a lot of references to light and a lot of references to beautiful imagery associated with Juliet. Essentially he's describing her and talking about how he is viewing her. So we have, but soft what light through yonder window breaks, it is the east and Juliet the sun. Arise, fair sun, and kill the envious moon, who is already sick and pale with grief, that thou her maid are far more fair than she. So immediately we've got Juliet being compared to the sun, and the fact that the sun can kill the envious moon. We've got a metaphor that Juliet's like a sun, whereas the old moon would be like Rosaline, and this new love that Romeo has is so much more brighter and so much more powerful than what he had before. He continues, but none her maid since she's envious, her vestal livery is but sick and green, and none but fools do wear it, cast it off. It is my lady, or it is my love, or that she knew she were. She speaks, yet she says nothing, what of that? Her eye decourses, I will answer it. I am too bold, 'tis not to me she speaks. So Romeo is contemplating breaking his silence here. He's contemplating announcing his presence to Juliet and saying, I am here and you are my love and I want you to know that. But he decides against that. He starts to wait, and he's unsure about whether he should speak at this point. He then goes on to mention, to me she speaks, two of the fairest stars in all heaven, having some business do entreat her eyes to twinkle in their spheres till they return. What if her eyes were there, they in her head? The brightness of her cheek would shame those stars as daylight doth her lamp. Her eye in heaven would through an airy region stream so bright that birds would sing and think it were no night. See how she leans her cheek upon thy hand. Oh, that I were a glove upon that hand that might touch thy cheek. So we have this consistent reference to light imagery. He describes her eyes like two stars of heaven. So this is a continuing of the way that Romeo speaks using these metaphors. And also that the brightness of her cheeks would shame that. The fact that she would even trick the birds into thinking it was daytime. She's that bright and beautiful. He ends his long soliloquy with, she leans her cheek upon the hand, or that I were a glove upon that hand, which goes back to the first meeting where we have she just unriched the hand of yonder knight. We have the fact that he's wishing that he was a glove upon the hand just so he could get close to Juliet and be there next to her. The next part of the scene, Romeo starts with, she speaks, or speak again, bright angel, for thou art as glorious this night, being over my head as a winged messenger from heaven. So again, he's using metaphor here to describe Juliet like an angel, something that's beyond human, something that is almost divine and godlike. Can we link this back to how he described her as a holy shrine in Act 1? He says that wondering eyes of mortals that fall back to gaze on him when he bestrides the lazy puffing clouds and sails beyond the bosom of the air. The fact that Juliet is angelic and almost otherworldly, that the mortals of the world and the ordinary people wouldn't be able to cope. Now we have one of the famous lines of the play now where Juliet says, Romeo, Romeo, wherefore art thou Romeo? Deny thy father and refuse thy name, or if thou wilt not, but be sworn my love, and I'll no longer be a Capulet. This is Juliet essentially saying that she's longing for Romeo. Wherefore art thou? Where are you? And she wants to know where he is. She says, deny thy father and refuse thy name. So give up being a Montague, challenge your father and stop being a Montague so that you can be with me. Remember, that's the last part of Act 1, which is my only love sprung from my only hate. And then she says something that's quite revealing. Or if thou wilt not, but will be sworn to love me, I'll no longer be a Capulet. In fact, she's willing to give up her family name and the importance of being a Capulet. She's going to give that up to be with Romeo. And Romeo, at this startling news, says, shall I hear more and shall I speak at this? So should he listen or should he show himself to Juliet and tell her that he feels exactly the same way? So, having had Romeo's long soliloquy where he describes Juliet as a bright angel, like the sun, like shining stars in her eyes, we now have a shorter soliloquy from Juliet describing her emotions and her feelings at the time, just before Romeo that shows himself to her. So we have, "'Tis but thy name that is my enemy, thou art thyself, though not a Montague. What Montague? It is not hand, nor foot, nor arm, nor face, nor any other part belonging to a man. Or be some other name. What is in a name? That which we call a rose, would by any other word would smell as sweet. So Romeo would, were he not Romeo called. Retain that deep affection which he owes. Without that title, Romeo doff thy name, and for that name which is no part of thee, take all myself." So we have a few interesting ideas in here. We have the fact that it is only the name of Montague which is Juliet's enemy. She doesn't see Romeo as an enemy, she sees the name. And she asks herself these rhetorical questions. What is a Montague? It's not a hand, a foot, an arm, a face, or any other part of a human being. It's just a name, that's all it is. So she thinks about naming as a whole and says that that which we call a rose, if you change the name of a rose, it would still smell as sweet, and therefore Romeo would, were he not Romeo called. Romeo would still have the same personality, he would be the same person, even if he wasn't a Montague. So therefore we've got these interesting ideas of Juliet thinking about naming and about the ridiculousness of the situation of having to hate all Montagues. And then at this point, Romeo says, "I take thee at thy word. Call me but love, and I'll be new baptized. Henceforth, I'll never will be Romeo." He leaps out at this point and confronts Juliet, having heard that she wants to take him away and change him. He says, "I'll take thee at thy word. Call me but love, and I'll be new baptized. I will change myself. I'll have a new baptism or a new birth, just to be with you. And then Juliet is obviously quite shocked by this. She's not expected someone to have been listening to what she says, and says, "What man art thou, bescreened in night, and stumblest on my counsels?" So bescreened being hidden away, and stumblest on her own private thoughts, like listening to her. So she's quite shocked by the fact that Romeo's there, but secretly quite pleased to see him and having had him hear what she just said about taking him for her love. The next part of the scene, we have Romeo making some promises and deciding that ultimately he would rather be with Juliet than be a Montague. He says, I know not how to tell who I am. My name, dear saint, is hateful to myself because it is an enemy to thee. The fact that he's now deciding that he would rather be loved by Juliet than be a Montague. Juliet says, my ears have not yet drunk 100 words of thy tongue's uttering, yet I know the sound. Art thou not Romeo and a Montague? So she says, I know now that you're a Montague. Is this not true? And Romeo says, neither, fair maid, if thee dislike. And he says, I will change myself. I will not be a Montague anymore if that's what it takes to love you. Juliet is quite shocked by what Romeo has done and says, the orchard walls are high and hard to climb, and this place is death, considering who thou art, if any of my kinsmen find thee here. She's reiterating to Romeo the massive risk that he's taken by coming back to this party, that he would be put to death if he was found in the Capulet house and to have broken in. The orchard walls are high and hard to climb. This was quite a physical task for Romeo to get back into the party. But Romeo says, with love's bright wings I did overperch these walls, for stony limits cannot hold love out, and what love can do that dares love attempt, therefore thy kinsmen are no stop to me. He says that he was possessed by love, and with wings he did leap over the walls because he was so taken by Juliet and so felt so in love with her. But Juliet, again for the practical person, ends with, if they do see thee, they will murder thee. The fact that she's reiterating to Romeo, this is a huge risk that you've taken here. Okay, so we know now that Romeo's taken a huge risk to break back in there, and Juliet has warned him that if he is found, then he will be killed by her family. But Romeo says that love's light wings had leapt him over the wall, that he was so enraptured with her, that he was so obsessed with her that he had to do these things. And this continues in the next couple of exchanges where Romeo is showing how devoted he is and how he's willing to take these risks, and Juliet, a little bit more practical, starts to think of the questions and starts to wonder about their relationship and what the consequences could be. So Romeo, one of the big things he says is, yet were it so as far as the vast shore washed with the farthest seas, I would adventure for such merchandise. The fact that he would risk everything to get to Juliet, he would travel the widest ocean, he would swim the furthest sea just to get back to her. And Juliet says, thou know'st the mask of night is on my face, else would a maiden blush bepaint my cheek. She's embarrassed by this. She's embarrassed by how flamboyant Romeo has been and how much she has fallen for him. And she worries about this. She says, dost thou love me? I know thou wilt say aye, and I will take thy word. Yet if thou swearest, thou may prove false. So she's saying, if you say you love me and you say yes, that you love me, you might still be false. You might not be true. This might change in time. So she's worried and she's concerned, and she's worried about herself. She says, oh, thou thinkst I am too quickly won. I'll frown and be perverse and say thee nay if thou wilt woo, but else not for the world. In truth, fair Montague, I am too fond. She's surprised at herself how easily she's fallen in love and how quickly. But she says, at the very bottom, my love's true passion, pardon me, and not impede this yielding to light love, which the dark night hath so discovered. She's saying this is true love. It might be quick and it might be very fast, but this is love that is true. And Romeo responds with some what we've seen him do in the past, where he uses metaphor and he says, by the blessed moon I vow, with tips with silver all these fruit tree tops. He swears that by the moon he would never ever leave her or abandon her. However, what we have is Juliet isn't interested in Romeo's promises like that. She's not interested in him saying, "I swear by the moon that I'll be true to you." And she even says, "Swear not by the moon, the inconstant moon that monthly changes." So she's saying the moon changes. The moon changes its shape and changes its orbit. So therefore, why should I trust anything you say if you're swearing on the moon? And Romeo says, "What shall I swear by?" And Juliet responds with, "Do not swear at all, or if thou wilt, swear by thyself, which is the god of my idolatry, and I'll believe thee." So she's saying, you don't need to swear by other things, you just need to say that this is the truth, this is what I'm feeling. And she is reflecting Romeo's terminology, the fact that he calls her a holy shrine. She now calls him the god of my idolatry, the god that I would worship. So she's starting to use this same sort of language in this sort of passionate, romantic way. So Juliet says, "Do not swear, although I joy in thee, I have no joy of this contract tonight. It is too rash, too unadvised, too sudden." Now, this is quite an important part. That Juliet's a bit more practical, and she's saying that it's rash, it's risky, it's unadvised. Other people would advise them against it, and too sudden and too quick. It's like lightning, which is so quick and powerful, but then does cease to be. It's over very, very quickly. So Juliet doesn't want this just to be a passionate single emotion and then just disappear. She wants this to be long and lasting, but that's a risk, and it's going to be challenging for them to do. She even says that it would be better if this was to be over. So possibly this wouldn't. We could say it's not the time, and we could say good night and sweet repose and rest, and just enjoy what they have had. But ultimately, she feels that it's potentially too risky and too challenging a relationship, despite these passionate, wonderful feelings that she's feeling. Okay, so again at this point in the play, we really need to take suspend our disbelief a little bit about how quickly things are moving, because at this point the characters decide to make a promise and a vow to each other. Bear in mind they've only met each other once in this one evening, and they've probably spoken, as Juliet says, less than 100 words to each other. So Romeo says, "Oh, will thou leave me so unsatisfied?" And Juliet responds with, "What satisfaction canst thou have tonight?" Now, initially we might think that Romeo is asking for physical satisfaction, but then he changes and he says, "The exchange of thy love's faithful vow for mine." So he asks Juliet, what I am asking for that would really satisfy me is your marriage vow, that you would vow to marry me. Juliet responds with, "I gave thee mine before thou didst request it, and yet I would, if I were, I would give it again." So she's so excited by this that she says, "I would have given you this before you even asked, and now I would do it again if I could possibly give it to you again." So Romeo asks, rather than for physical satisfaction, he asks for the satisfaction of having Juliet as his wife. So at this point, the nurse, absolutely perfect time, interrupts and calls to Juliet. So Juliet says, "I hear some noise within. Dear love, adieu. Stay but a while and I will come again." So Juliet disappears off to the balcony to go and speak to the nurse. She leaves, and Romeo is left in his own thoughts and says, "Oh, blessed, blessed night, I am afraid, being in night, all this is but a dream, too flattering, sweet to be substantial." He's worried that this is a dream, that everything is happening so perfectly and so wonderfully. Juliet re-enters and says, "3 words, dear Romeo, and good night indeed. If that thy bent of love be honourable, thy purpose marriage, send me word tomorrow, by 1, that I'll procure to come to thee, where and what time thou wilt perform the rite, and all my fortunes at thy foot I'll lay, and follow thee, my lord, throughout the world." So Juliet says 3 words, and then it will be good night from her, and that if Romeo's love and intentions are true and honest, to send word to her tomorrow about where and when to meet him, and that they will get married that very next day. Now, this is a very, very quick escalation of love, and it's a very significant promise that these two characters are now making to each other. They know the risks that Juliet initially thinks is too rash, too sudden, but now they've decided that to be married and make that vow to each other is going to be very, very important. Okay, to end the scene, we have Romeo and Juliet saying goodnight to each other and parting, ready for their wedding the next day. Now, it takes forever. They both almost refuse to leave, and they keep saying goodnight and then coming back. So the showing the connection, the deep connection between them. There's a lot of text here where it's backwards and forwards, but a few interesting images. There's one where Romeo says that love goes towards love as schoolboys from their books, but love from love towards school with heavy looks. So what we have here is Romeo's using the imagery of schoolboys who are handing in their exercise books, and the freedom of that would be a perfect example of love. But if we are leaving love behind, like he's doing with Juliet, it's like being trudging back to school to do more work. So it's quite an interesting little image. Juliet describes the use of, she wishes that she could call upon echo and hear Romeo's name and his voice constantly, so that she should never feel that she's missing him or leaving him behind. She even describes Romeo later on as like she wishes he was a falcon that she could call upon and bring back at any point, as it is a sweet sorrow to part. That the fact that it's a nice thing to say I love you and good night, but it's a sorrowful thing because it means that they won't be there with each other. Ultimately, the characters they part and they leave ready for the next day, and Romeo heads off to meet the friar to organise what he's going to do and how he can arrange to make a message to Juliet for them to arrange to be married. Okay, apologies that that's been quite a long run through for Act 2, Scene 2, but like I say, it is a very, very important scene. It's crucial that you understand the relationship between these two characters. So for you to do for this lesson, what I'd like you to do is to have a look at the two different characters and have a look at how they behave and what they say within this scene. So for each character, I would like you to do 10 quotations that you think are significant about how they feel about each other. So the way that I would do this potentially would be either to do like a PowerPoint slide with an image of Romeo and 10 quotations from Romeo, and then an image of Juliet and 10 quotations of Juliet. Or if you've got big A3 paper, it might be a good idea to split them up that way. However you'd like to present it, but look at both the characters and how they feel about each other. And the second thing I'd like to think about is how Shakespeare's using language to make this relationship seem sudden and exciting. I'd like you to do that as a PEE response, looking at least 3 paragraphs on how Shakespeare's making this seem sudden and exciting and inviting. The text will come up in a couple of seconds, and if you stay tuned at the end, we've got today's film recommendation. Okay, so for today's film recommendation, I've gone for a family classic, a film that tugs at the heartstrings in all the right places, and has some of the most memorable moments of cinema, certainly in the last 40 years, I would suggest, and that's E.T. It's a fantastic film, really worth checking out, especially if you haven't seen it, and just a good one when one of those days where it's feeling a bit rough and you need something to make you feel a little bit better. So I hope you enjoy. Next time we're going to have a look at Act 2 Scene 3, and then we're going to be looking at how the marriage is starting to fall into place, and continuing our reading through of Act 2. Until then, take care and hope you're all staying safe.